A massive Apache patrol surrounded his house for the favor he did to their daughters. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. In the heart of the rugged American West, where the dust hangs in the air and the land stretches as far as the eye can see, there lived a rancher named Thomas Grant. His cabin sat alone in the vast, open plains of New Mexico, miles away from the nearest neighbor. Thomas was the kind of man who preferred solitude. His days were spent tending to his cattle, repairing fences, and watching the sun rise and set over the quiet horizon. It wasn't that he disliked people, but after losing his family to a tragic accident years ago, he had found peace in isolation. His only company was the wind, the rustling of the tall grass, and the occasional sound of his cattle lowing in the distance. One sweltering summer afternoon, as Thomas was working on his barn, he noticed a group of women and children on horseback approaching his property. They looked weary, their clothes torn, faces sunburned and desperate. Among them was a young girl, limping, her face strained with pain. Thomas paused his work, wiping the sweat from his brow as he watched them draw closer. He wasn't sure what to make of them, but the moment he saw the girl struggling to stay on her horse, his instincts kicked in. Without a second thought, Thomas grabbed a bucket of water and hurried toward the group. "You look like you could use some help," he called out, offering the water to the girl. She hesitated for a moment, but then gratefully took the water. Her eyes, wide with relief, met his. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice weak. "We've been traveling for days. We lost our way." Thomas nodded, his heart softening. He knew the land out here could be unforgiving, especially for those who didn't know it well. "Come, I'll give you some shelter for the night," he said. "You look like you need rest." The young girl smiled faintly, and the others in the group nodded in gratitude. They followed him to the cabin, where Thomas provided them with food and a place to sleep. The night was quiet, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he had just done something important, something that might change his life in ways he didn't yet understand. As the days passed, the group remained at his ranch, recovering from their long journey. Thomas didn't ask too many questions. He figured they were just travelers, possibly from one of the nearby Native American tribes. He didn't expect anything in return for his kindness. After all, he had always believed that a man should do good without expecting anything back. Little did he know, this small act of kindness would lead to something much larger than he ever imagined. The next morning, Thomas awoke early, just as the first rays of the sun peeked over the distant mountains, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. It was a quiet morning, like so many others in the vast wilderness of New Mexico. But today, there was an unease in the air, a sense of something waiting just beyond the horizon. He stepped outside to find the women and children gathered near his barn, preparing to leave. The young girl, who had limped into his life just days before, looked healthier, her face brighter. She smiled at him as he approached, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you again for everything," she said softly, her voice now steady. "You saved our lives." Thomas nodded, not sure how to respond. It was just the right thing to do, he thought. Helping people in need was something his mother had taught him long ago. He had never expected anything in return. As he turned to go back inside, he heard the sound of horses approaching from the distance. He paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. The sound grew louder, growing steadily closer, until it was clear that a group of riders was heading toward his ranch. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen enough to know that when large groups of riders came without warning, trouble was often close behind. As he stood frozen, watching the riders draw nearer, the young girl who had been so grateful for his help suddenly stiffened. She looked over her shoulder, her expression changing from warmth to something darker, something fearful. She turned to him, her voice urgent. "You need to hide," she whispered. "They are coming for us. They are coming for what you did for us." Before he could ask her what she meant, the riders were upon them. Thomas counted at least 20 men, all on horseback, their faces painted and their bodies adorned with the symbols of their tribe. At their head was a tall, imposing figure, a man whose gaze alone seemed to command respect. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as the riders dismounted, surrounding the group. The leader approached Thomas slowly, his eyes narrowing as he examined the rancher. There was an air of authority about him that was impossible to ignore. The young girl stepped forward, her face tense. She spoke to the leader in a language that Thomas didn't understand, her words sharp and quick. The leader nodded once, then turned his attention back to Thomas. "You helped our daughters," the man said in broken English. "That is something few would do. We are here to repay you." Thomas stood frozen, trying to process what was happening. The girl had been one of their daughters? The realization hit him hard. He had never imagined the people he had helped would be from a tribe as powerful as this one. But the words of the leader were clear. They were not here to harm him. They had come to offer their protection. The leader motioned to the warriors, who began to fan out across the property, their eyes scanning the horizon, looking for any sign of danger. The young girl, still standing beside Thomas, smiled softly. "You are safe now," she said. "Our tribe will watch over you. We owe you a debt, and we will honor it." Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. Just days ago, he had been alone, working in the silence of his ranch, never expecting his life to change in such a dramatic way. And now, here was a tribe of Apache warriors surrounding his land, offering their protection in exchange for a simple act of kindness. He had done nothing but help a girl in need, and now, it seemed, that small act had led to a miracle. The leader gave him a final look before he turned to the warriors, issuing commands in their native tongue. As the warriors began to organize, Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. His small, quiet life was no longer just about survival. It had become something much larger, something that would change everything he knew about kindness, gratitude, and the strength of a simple gesture. As the days passed, Thomas found himself settling into an uneasy routine with the Apache warriors around his property. The initial shock had worn off, but the weight of the situation still hung over him like a storm cloud. Each morning, he would wake up to the sound of warriors moving silently across the land, keeping watch, ensuring that no harm would come to his home. The leader, whose name was Dakota, had made it clear that their presence was to ensure his safety, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. One evening, as Thomas sat outside, repairing a fence, Dakota approached him. The warrior was a towering figure, his face marked with the traditional war paint of his people, but there was a kindness in his eyes that made Thomas feel less threatened. "Thomas Grant," Dakota said, his voice steady and deep, "you have shown great courage and kindness to our people. You have given us something we have not seen in many moons. But now, there is something I must ask of you." Thomas put down his tools and looked up at Dakota, unsure of what was coming next. "What is it you ask?" he said, his voice cautious. Dakota motioned to the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the land. "We are preparing for something. A test of loyalty. Our tribe is under threat from those who would seek to destroy us, and we must ensure that we stand united. You have helped us, and now we ask for your help in return." Thomas's heart raced. He had already done more than he had ever expected by helping the girl, but now Dakota was asking something much more. "What do you need from me?" Thomas asked, feeling a deep sense of responsibility. Dakota stepped closer, lowering his voice as if speaking of something sacred. "We ask that you come with us. Stand beside us in our fight. The men who wish to harm our people are powerful, and they will not be easily defeated. But with your help, we believe we can overcome them." Thomas's mind raced. The idea of joining the Apache in battle was something he had never considered. He had spent his entire life avoiding conflict, preferring the solitude of his ranch. But something about Dakota's words struck a chord in him. He thought of the kindness he had shown the girl, of the protection the tribe had offered him in return. He realized that, for the first time in a long while, he had a chance to make a real difference. "I will help," Thomas said, his voice firm. Dakota smiled, a look of approval crossing his face. "You will not regret this, Thomas Grant. You are no longer just a rancher. You are part of our tribe now." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. The Apache warriors taught Thomas how to move with them, how to fight with the strength of the land beneath his feet. He learned their ways, their language, and their customs. It was hard at first, but he quickly found his rhythm, his confidence growing with each passing day. As the day of the battle drew near, Thomas stood beside Dakota and the other warriors, looking out over the land that had been his home for so long. He realized, with a start, that this was no longer just about survival. It was about something much larger, about honor, duty, and the ties that bound them all together. When the day of the battle arrived, Thomas rode out with the Apache warriors, feeling the weight of his decision. He was no longer an outsider, no longer a man hiding from the world. He was part of something much greater, something that would change the course of history. As the battle raged on, Thomas fought alongside the Apache warriors with a ferocity he never knew he had. It was hard, brutal work, but he didn't falter. He remembered the faces of the girls he had helped, of the tribe that had shown him kindness, and he fought with all his strength. By the time the battle was over, the enemy had been defeated. The Apache had triumphed, and Thomas had earned his place among them. Dakota stood beside him, his eyes filled with pride. "You fought well, Thomas Grant," he said. "You are one of us now." Thomas looked out over the land, the sun setting in the distance. He had made his choice. He had stood with the Apache, and together, they had secured a future for their people. It was a future he would fight for, a future where kindness and honor would always prevail. Days turned into weeks, and the Apache tribe continued to thrive in the wake of their victory. Thomas had earned not only their respect, but also a deep bond of trust. His role in the battle had changed him. The solitude of his ranch, the life he had lived in isolation, seemed like a distant memory now. He had found a purpose, a sense of belonging that he had not known in years. The warriors and their families respected him, and even the elders began to look at him as one of their own. However, despite this newfound camaraderie, Thomas could not shake the feeling that something still lay ahead, something more profound than he could see. It was one evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the camp, when Dakota approached him once again. "Thomas," he said, his voice low but firm, "there is something that needs to be done. A debt still remains." Thomas raised an eyebrow. He had done everything the tribe had asked of him, fought beside them, and earned their gratitude. "What debt is left to settle?" he asked, genuinely confused. Dakota gestured toward the horizon where the distant sound of thunder rumbled in the distance. "Our enemies have not been defeated entirely. There are still those who wish to challenge us, who see our victory as something to be undone. A group of settlers has been gathering near the borders, spreading rumors, and claiming that the Apache are nothing more than thieves and killers." Thomas's stomach tightened at the mention of settlers. He had heard whispers of tensions rising in the area, but he had hoped it would stay far from his peaceful life. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Dakota looked him in the eye, and Thomas saw the weight of responsibility in the warrior's gaze. "You must go and speak to them. Convince them that we are not the enemy. You are the bridge between our two worlds, Thomas. If anyone can make them understand, it is you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas felt the weight of the task ahead. He had never considered himself a diplomat, let alone a messenger between two cultures that had been at odds for so long. But Dakota's trust in him was undeniable, and in that moment, Thomas realized that he couldn't turn back. The next morning, Thomas saddled his horse, the same one that had carried him through the battle. He rode for hours, his mind filled with a sense of uncertainty. The idea of speaking to the settlers, of convincing them that the Apache were not their enemies, felt like an impossible task. He knew that the scars of the past ran deep, and it would take more than words to heal them. As he neared the camp where the settlers had gathered, he saw their tents rising in the distance, smoke rising from campfires, and men standing guard. It was a scene he had seen many times before in his life, but this time, he was not just a passerby. He was a representative of the Apache, a man who had fought beside them, and who now carried their message. When he arrived at the camp, he was met with suspicion. The settlers eyed him warily, their hands resting on the handles of rifles and tools. But Thomas, who had spent so many years alone, knew how to read people, how to make them see the humanity in others. He dismounted slowly, holding his hands open in a gesture of peace. "I come in peace," he said, his voice steady. "I am Thomas Grant, and I have come to speak on behalf of the Apache." The settlers exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of him. The leader of the group, a tall man with a weathered face, stepped forward. "What do you want, Grant?" he asked, his voice rough, like a man used to conflict. "You've been living among them, haven't you? You've seen what they're capable of." Thomas shook his head. I've seen what they're capable of, yes. But I've also seen their humanity, their honor. They are not the monsters you think them to be. The settlers looked at him, skeptical. And what do you expect us to do? The leader asked, crossing his arms. They killed our families, our friends. They've taken our land, our livelihoods. Thomas felt a pang of guilt, but he did not waver. I know the history, but you cannot judge an entire people by the actions of a few. The Apache are not the enemy. They are people, just like you and me. They have families, children, and dreams. They want to live in peace, but they will fight to protect what is theirs. The leader's eyes softened slightly, but his skepticism remained. What do you want us to do, Grant? Just forget the past. Thomas took a deep breath. No, I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to see them for who they are now. The Apache want peace. They want to coexist with you, to work together, but they will not stand by while you threaten their way of life. The tension in the air was palpable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the leader nodded slowly, as if considering Thomas's words. We'll see, he said, his voice quiet but thoughtful. We'll see if peace is possible. As Thomas rode back to the Apache camp, he felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. He had done what he could, but he knew that words alone wouldn't change everything. The real test would come when the settlers and the Apache met face to face. But for the first time in a long while, Thomas had hope. The seeds of peace had been planted, and now it was up to both sides to decide whether to let them grow. The days that followed were tense. Thomas had done what he could to plant the seeds of peace between the Apache and the settlers, but the real test was still ahead. He had ridden out to meet the settlers, spoken of peace, but now the time had come for both sides to come together and see if they could truly coexist. It was a delicate balance, and as Thomas made his way back to the Apache camp, he knew the stakes were high. He had returned to the ranch to prepare, and as he stood outside his cabin one morning, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the plains. His heart raced. He wasn't sure if the settlers were coming to make good on their promise of peace or if this was the beginning of a new conflict. As the riders drew near, he recognized the leader of the settler group, the tall man who had questioned him before. The leader nodded to Thomas but kept his distance. We've come to talk, he said. But know this, Grant. We're not here to make deals. We're here to see if what you said is true. We'll see if the Apache are truly as you say. Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had spoken of peace, but this was no guarantee. He couldn't help but wonder if he was walking into a trap. Still, he nodded and motioned for them to follow him toward the Apache camp. The settlers were wary, their hands resting on their rifles as they moved toward the gathering of Apache warriors. The tension in the air was palpable, and Thomas knew that this was a moment that could change everything. Dakota stood at the front of the group, his warriors lined up behind him, their eyes trained on the approaching settlers. There was a heaviness in the air as both sides took their positions, neither one willing to make the first move. Thomas stepped forward, his voice carrying across the distance. These people came to talk, he said, his tone steady. Let's hear them out. Dakota gave a single nod, and the Apache warriors remained still, their eyes never leaving the settlers. The leader of the settlers stepped forward, his voice firm. We've heard rumors, and we've seen enough to know that the Apache are not to be trusted. But you, Grant, you say they're not our enemy. You fought beside them. You say they're just like us. He paused, eyeing Thomas carefully. Are you willing to put your life on the line for that? Are you willing to stand with them against your own kind? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas felt his heart pound in his chest. He had already made his decision when he helped the girl, but now, the full weight of his choice was coming to bear. He could feel the eyes of both the settlers and the Apache on him, waiting for his response. The wind blew across the plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and the promise of something new. Thomas took a deep breath, his hands steady at his sides. I'm willing to stand by what I believe in, he said quietly. And I believe that the Apache are not our enemies. They are people just like us. And if we're going to survive in this land, we need to work together. The settlers exchanged uncertain glances, their hands still on their rifles, but none of them spoke. Dakota stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. We are not the savages you think us to be, he said, his words measured. We have fought to survive, just as you have. We want peace, but we will not allow our people to be destroyed. You must make the choice, settlers. Will you stand with us or continue to fight against us? The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of the wind. The leader of the settlers looked at Dakota, then at Thomas, his eyes narrowing as he weighed the decision before him. Finally, he spoke. We will see, he said, his voice heavy. But mark my words, Grant. If your people turn on us, there will be no forgiveness. With that, the settlers mounted their horses and began to leave, their gazes lingering on Thomas and the Apache warriors as they rode away. Thomas stood there, his heart still racing, unsure of what the future held. But he knew one thing for certain. He had done what he could. He had planted the seeds of peace, and now, it was up to both sides to decide whether they would take root. Dakota stepped beside him, his eyes steady. You did well, Thomas Grant, he said quietly. You gave them a chance. Now we must wait. And so, the waiting began. Days passed, and Thomas returned to his ranch, unsure of what would come next. The winds of change were blowing, and he could only hope that the future would bring a lasting peace for the Apache and the settlers alike. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the land, Thomas stood on his porch, staring into the horizon. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing. He had fought for what was right, and that, he believed, was enough. Weeks passed, and the winds of change seemed to settle over the land. Thomas could feel the shift, but it was a subtle thing, like the quiet before a storm. The Apache warriors remained vigilant, guarding their territory and preparing for whatever came next. The settlers, too, had settled into a sort of uneasy calm. The tension between the two groups lingered, but there were no signs of violence, and that in itself was a small victory. But Thomas knew that peace was fragile, and he could not afford to become complacent. One morning, just as the sun began to rise, casting its golden light over the plains, Thomas received unexpected visitors. He was outside, tending to his cattle, when he saw a group of men on horseback approaching. They wore the familiar garb of settlers, but there was something different about them. They weren't from the group he had spoken to before. These men were older, their faces marked with the hard lines of experience. As they drew near, Thomas could see that they were armed, their eyes scanning the land warily. He stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of his rifle, though he made no move to draw it. What brings you here? He called out, his voice steady. The leader of the group, a tall man with a grizzled beard and a scar over his left eye, dismounted his horse and approached. We heard what happened, he said gruffly. Heard about the talk with the Apache. Thought we'd come see for ourselves. Thomas raised an eyebrow. He wasn't sure what to make of this sudden visit, but he kept his stance firm. What do you mean? See for yourselves? He asked. The man's eyes narrowed, and he glanced back at his companions. We're not here for trouble, he said, though his tone was heavy with something else. But we need to know if it's safe to trust the Apache. If you stand with them, what does that mean for us? Thomas felt a pang of frustration. He had done what he could to plant the seeds of peace. He had risked his own life to try and bring these two groups together, and now, after all this time, there were still questions, still doubts. You saw for yourself that they want peace, Thomas said, his voice growing more resolute. They want to live in harmony with you. But peace takes effort from both sides. The leader looked at him, his gaze calculating. We've heard what you said, but peace doesn't always work that way. The Apache, they've always been a threat. You can't just forget the past, Grant. The word stung, but Thomas stood his ground. I'm not asking anyone to forget the past, he said firmly. But the future is what we make of it. If we continue to hold on to old grudges, we'll never move forward. The leader seemed to consider this for a long moment, his face hardening into something unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. We'll see, he said quietly. But if anything happens, if those Apache betray us, we'll be ready. With that, the group mounted their horses and turned to leave, leaving Thomas standing in the growing light of dawn. He watched them ride off, his mind racing with the weight of what had just transpired. The seeds of peace had been planted, but the road ahead was still uncertain. That afternoon, Dakota came to visit him, his face serious as he approached. What happened? Dakota asked, his voice low. Thomas recounted the conversation with the settlers, detailing their doubts and their reluctance to fully embrace peace. Dakota listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Thomas finished, Dakota nodded slowly. They are not ready, he said quietly. But they are not our enemies. Not yet. Thomas felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but hearing Takota's words only reinforced the reality that peace wasn't a given. It had to be earned, and it would take time. Over the next few weeks, Thomas worked harder than ever to foster trust between the Apache and the settlers. He facilitated conversations, worked alongside both groups, and did his best to show that peace was possible. There were moments of tension, moments when old wounds seemed ready to surface, but there were also moments of hope. Slowly but surely, the two sides began to see the benefits of cooperation. One evening, as Thomas was walking through the camp, he saw something that gave him hope. A group of Apache warriors were working alongside a group of settlers, building a fence that would mark the boundary between their lands. The work was slow, and there were still moments of awkwardness, but the shared effort spoke volumes. Peace wasn't here yet, but it was beginning to take root. Takota approached Thomas as the sun set, casting a soft glow over the land. "You have done well, Thomas Grant," he said quietly. "You have shown them what is possible. Now we must be patient." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of the journey ahead. "We've made progress," he said, "but there's still a long way to go." Takota smiled, his eyes filled with quiet wisdom. "Yes, but every step forward is a victory." As the two men stood together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Thomas felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. The fight for peace was worth it. And as long as there was hope, as long as there were people willing to work for a better future, peace was always possible. As the weeks turned into months, the uneasy peace between the Apache and the settlers continued to hold, though it was far from perfect. Thomas could see the cracks, the lingering mistrust that still simmered beneath the surface. The Apache warriors, though initially eager to show their goodwill, were wary of the settlers' true intentions. And the settlers, while less hostile than before, still struggled to fully embrace the idea of working alongside the Apache. But Thomas refused to give up. He continued to work tirelessly, urging both sides to meet in the middle, to see the other's humanity. One evening, after another long day of building fences and working the land, Thomas sat outside his cabin, watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. The sound of approaching riders interrupted his solitude. He stood up, his heart racing as he scanned the horizon. The riders were different this time. There were fewer of them, but they were all dressed in the distinctive garb of the settlers. Leading them was the tall man, the one who had been skeptical of the Apache from the beginning. As they drew closer, Thomas could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was a turning point. The settlers had come to see if the peace could truly last. The leader of the group dismounted and approached Thomas slowly, his face unreadable. "Grant," he said, his voice low, "we've come to talk. We've been hearing reports from some of our people. There are still whispers of Apache attacks, and some of our families are scared. We need answers." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. He had worked so hard to keep the peace, to show that the Apache were not the enemy. But now, it seemed, doubt was creeping back into the settlers' minds. He had to keep his composure. "I understand your fears," Thomas said, his voice steady. "But you've seen for yourselves that the Apache want peace. They want to live alongside you, not against you. There will always be a few who resist change, but the majority are ready to move forward." The leader of the settlers looked at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And how do you know that? How do you know they're not just waiting for the right moment to strike?" Thomas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've seen their ways. I've fought beside them. I know their hearts. They don't want war. They want to build a future, just like you do. It's up to both of us to make that future happen." There was a long silence as the leader of the settlers considered his words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice less accusatory than before. "We've heard what you've said, and we've seen the progress. But what if we're wrong? What if this peace is just a fleeting illusion?" Thomas stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "Then we will fight for it," he said, his voice firm. "We will fight for peace. And we will show the world that it's possible, no matter how long it takes." The leader nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of skepticism and hope. "I'll admit, I didn't think it was possible. But you've given us something to believe in, Grant." The settlers mounted their horses and began to leave, but the leader turned back to Thomas before riding off. "We'll be watching," he said. But for now, we'll give it time. Just don't let us down. As the sun set and the last of the settlers disappeared into the distance, Thomas felt a surge of hope. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a step in the right direction. The battle for peace was far from over, but Thomas knew that with each passing day, they were one step closer to making it a reality. Over the following weeks, Thomas worked even harder to bridge the gap between the two groups. He helped the settlers with their crops, shared meals with them, and continued to encourage the Apache to do the same. Slowly but surely, the two sides began to find common ground. There were still moments of tension, moments when old prejudices threatened to undo the progress they had made. But for every setback, there was also a victory. One evening, Dakota came to visit Thomas. He looked different, more hopeful than Thomas had seen him in a long time. "The settlers are starting to come around," Dakota said, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "They are beginning to understand what you've been trying to tell them. We can have peace." Thomas smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "It's not perfect," he said, "but it's a start." Dakota nodded. "Yes, a start. But we must continue to work. We must be patient, but we must also be ready." Thomas's heart swelled with pride. He had never imagined that his simple act of kindness would lead to something like this. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew that together, they could build a future of peace. A future where the Apache and settlers could coexist, side by side, with mutual respect and understanding. The days grew warmer, and with the arrival of summer, the small piece of land that Thomas had once called his own seemed to transform into something much greater. It was no longer just his ranch. It was a symbol of the fragile peace that had begun to take root between the Apache and the settlers. The work between the two groups continued, slow and steady, but progress was undeniable. Despite the growing sense of camaraderie, there were moments of tension that still threatened the delicate balance. Some settlers refused to completely trust the Apache, while certain Apache warriors remained cautious, fearful that the settlers might betray them at any moment. But Thomas never wavered. He had worked too hard to bring them together, and he refused to let the weight of mistrust tear everything apart. One evening, as he sat outside the cabin watching the sunset, Dakota rode up on horseback. His face was set in a serious expression, one that spoke of something weighing heavily on his mind. Thomas stood and approached him. "What's wrong?" he asked. Dakota looked at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with an emotion Thomas couldn't quite read. "The settlers, some of them are gathering again," Dakota said slowly. "There are whispers that the peace is just a temporary thing. They are preparing for something." Thomas's heart sank. He had known it was too early to relax, but hearing it confirmed was another matter. "How many?" he asked, his voice calm, but his mind racing. Dakota shook his head. "Not sure. But we must prepare. I do not want war, Thomas. But we must be ready." The urgency in Dakota's voice was something Thomas had rarely heard, and it made him realize just how much was at stake. They had worked so hard to get this far, and now, with everything hanging in the balance, the future seemed uncertain once again. "What do we do now?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his thoughts clear. Dakota looked out over the plains, his face hardening with resolve. "We will meet them. Speak with them. Let them know that we will not back down. We will defend our people, but we do not seek violence." Thomas nodded. "I'll go with you. I'll speak to the settlers again. I won't let them think that peace is a weakness." Dakota looked at him, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "You are one of us now, Thomas Grant. But remember, words are not always enough. Be ready for anything." The next morning, they set out, Thomas riding alongside Dakota and a small group of Apache warriors. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land as they rode toward the settlers' camp. Thomas's mind raced with what he might find there. Would this be the moment that all their hard work unraveled? Or would the settlers finally understand the importance of the peace they had worked so hard to create? When they arrived, they found a gathering of settlers standing around their campfires. The mood was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. The leader of the group, the same man who had questioned Thomas before, stood at the center, his face hard as stone. "Grant," he said, his voice low, "you've been warning us about the Apache. You said they wanted peace. But how can we trust that? How do we know that you haven't been deceived?" Thomas stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been prepared for this. but hearing the words out loud made it real. "You've seen for yourselves that the Apache have kept their word," he said, his voice steady. "You've worked alongside them, built fences, shared meals. They're not the enemy. They are just people, like you and me." The settlers looked at each other, their eyes filled with uncertainty. The leader stepped closer, his expression tight. "People? Or wolves in sheep's clothing?" he asked, his voice laced with doubt. "I won't risk my family for your words, Grant. You may be one of them now, but you're still a stranger to us." Thomas felt his frustration rising. He had done everything he could to bring them together, and still, the settlers refused to see the truth. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it," he said, his voice growing stronger. "But look at what we've built. Look at what we've done together. It's not perfect, but it's a start. And that's all we can do. Take a chance. Trust in the future we're trying to create." The leader remained silent for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, finally, he spoke. "Maybe you're right, Grant," he said, his voice quieter. "Maybe it's time we took a chance. But know this. If the Apache turn on us, if any harm comes to our people, we will not hesitate to defend ourselves." Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of the statement. "We will stand with you," he said. "But it's up to you to take that first step. We cannot force peace, but we can choose to live by it." The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, though the uncertainty still lingered. As the sun set behind the mountains, the two groups parted ways, the Apache returning to their camp and the settlers retreating to their own. Thomas felt a sense of cautious optimism, but he knew the journey was far from over. Peace was not a destination, it was a constant effort, a choice that both sides had to make every day. As the moon rose high in the sky, Thomas stood alone on the plains, staring into the vast, silent landscape. There was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of the future a little lighter. Peace was possible, but only if they were willing to fight for it, together. As the weeks turned into months, the fragile peace between the settlers and the Apache continued to hold. It was not without its challenges, but Thomas had never been more certain that this was the right path. The work continued, the fences were repaired, the crops grew, and the animals roamed the land in harmony. There were still whispers of doubt and fear among the settlers, but there was something different now. They were no longer simply reacting to threats. They were building something together. They were creating a future, not just for themselves, but for their children, and for the Apache who had become their neighbors. One crisp autumn morning, as the orange glow of the sun began to bathe the land, Thomas was standing outside his cabin, gazing over the horizon. He had always loved this time of day, the calm that came before the day's work began. But today was different. Today, the air felt heavy with anticipation. He could sense that something was about to happen. As he stood there, Dakota approached, his expression solemn. The two men had grown close in the months since the battle for peace had begun. Dakota had become not just a leader, but a friend, someone who understood the weight of the world that both men carried. "What's on your mind, Dakota?" Thomas asked, noticing the tension in the warrior's face. "The settlers," Dakota said, his voice low. "They are coming today. They have made a choice. But the question is, what will they bring with them?" Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of Dakota's words. The settlers had agreed to a meeting, one that could finally seal the fate of their fragile peace. Would they come with open hands, ready to move forward? Or would they come with distrust, ready to retreat into the old ways? The two men rode out to the meeting place, the air between them thick with uncertainty. As they arrived, they saw the settlers gathered around a large campfire, the firelight casting long shadows on their faces. The leader of the settlers, the man who had questioned Thomas all those months ago, stood at the front, flanked by a few others. When they saw Thomas and Dakota approach, they fell silent. The leader stepped forward, his face a mix of determination and uncertainty. "Grant," he said, his voice steady but tinged with doubt, "we have come to a decision. It has not been easy, but we have chosen to trust in the future. We will stand with you, with the Apache. We believe in the peace you have spoken of, but we need to see it in action. We need to believe that this is not just words." Thomas's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. This was it. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. "You've made the right choice," Thomas said, his voice full of conviction. "We are all in this together now. Let's show the world what we can build." The leader nodded, then turned to the group of settlers. "This is a new beginning," he said, his voice carrying across the camp. "We are no longer enemies. We are neighbors. And together, we will build a future for our children." The settlers cheered, a sound that echoed across the land. It wasn't the loud, triumphant cheer of a battle won, but the quiet, resolute cheer of a new chapter being written. Over the next few days, both the settlers and the Apache worked side by side, repairing fences, sharing meals, and teaching each other their ways. There were still moments of tension, moments when old prejudices flared up, but they were fewer and fewer. The bond between the two groups grew stronger with each passing day. And as the seasons changed, so did the land. The crops grew tall, the cattle flourished, and the once quiet, solitary ranch had become a bustling hub of cooperation. One evening, as Thomas sat with Dakota, watching the sun set over the mountains, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The work was far from done, but the foundation was there. They had created something real, something lasting. "It's not perfect," Thomas said, his voice thoughtful, "but it's a start." Dakota smiled, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. "A good start," he agreed, "and a long journey ahead." The two men sat in silence, watching the world unfold before them. They had faced down fear, prejudice, and doubt, and together, they had chosen a different path. The future was still uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Thomas knew that this was just the beginning. The peace they had fought for was fragile, but it was real. And with each new day, they would build on it, one step at a time.